Arzamas-16, known officially during the Soviet era as Sarov and unofficially as the city that did not exist, was the most secret location in the entire Soviet Union, a closed nuclear research city hidden deep within the forests of the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, surrounded by double fencing, minefields, armed patrols, and a level of secrecy so extreme that for decades it appeared on no maps. Its name was forbidden to be spoken, and the people who lived there could not tell friends or family where they were. And it is here, inside this invisible city, that the USSR built its first atomic bomb, developed its most powerful nuclear warheads, conducted top-secret weapons research, and created a scientific and political system so controlled that even the residents of the city existed outside normal Soviet citizenship structures. The story of Arzamas-16 began in 1946, immediately after the United States demonstrated the power of nuclear weapons in 1945, and the Soviet leadership, desperate to close the atomic gap, launched a crash program to design an atomic bomb of their own under the personal direction of Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the NKVD, who selected a remote monastery complex in Sarov as the site for what the Soviets called the installation, later renamed KB-11, the design bureau responsible for nuclear weapons. To transform this secluded religious center into the epicenter of the Soviet nuclear program, the NKVD evacuated its remaining monks, demolished its religious structures, and erected a sprawling complex of laboratories, workshops, living quarters, guarded perimeters, and artificial identities. And by 1947, tens of thousands of workers, scientists, engineers, soldiers, and prisoners were brought in, many against their will, to begin building what would become the most important restricted city in Soviet history. Arzamas-16 was unique among Soviet closed cities because it operated as a hybrid of scientific excellence and totalitarian control, combining world-class physicists such as Igor Kurchatov, Andrei Sakharov, Yuli Khariton, and Yakov Zeldovich with political overseers who monitored their every move, restricted their communication, and enforced strict secrecy protocols. Residents were given fabricated addresses. Their mail was censored. They were forbidden from traveling beyond the city's perimeter without special authorization, and even their death certificates would list false locations. At its peak, the city held approximately 30,000 people, functioning as a self-contained microstate with its own schools, shops, cultural centers, and transportation networks, all sealed from the outside world. For scientists, life inside Arzamas-16 was paradoxical. They enjoyed better living standards, more food, higher pay, and professional prestige compared to other Soviet citizens. Yet they were effectively prisoners, unable to leave or discuss their work, and constantly aware that Beria's security forces monitored every conversation. The city's early years were defined by intense pressure from Stalin to deliver a functioning atomic bomb as quickly as possible, especially after the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. Under this pressure, scientists at Arzamas-16 developed the USSR's first atomic bomb, RDS-1, tested in 1949, using a design reverse-engineered from classified information leaked by Soviet spies in the Manhattan Project, including Klaus Fuchs. The success of RDS-1 shocked the world, erased America's monopoly on nuclear weapons, and cemented Arzamas-16 as the central pillar of Soviet military power. As the Cold War escalated, Arzamas-16 became even more critical, transitioning from atomic weapons to thermonuclear devices, and in the early 1950s, Andrei Sakharov, working inside the city, proposed the concept for the Soviet hydrogen bomb, eventually leading to the development of RDS-6s, the USSR's first thermonuclear weapon tested in 1953. but Arzamas-16's most infamous contribution came in 1961, when it designed the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated, with a yield of 50 megatons, created primarily as a geopolitical message to the United States and NATO at the height of Cold War tension. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Arzamas-16 diversified its research, working not only on nuclear bombs, but on warhead miniaturization, missile integration, compact tactical nuclear weapons, and safety systems, while also conducting classified experiments on nuclear physics, materials science, and neutron behavior. Yet life inside the city remained harshly controlled. Every resident lived under constant surveillance. Internal passports were confiscated, and the state enforced strict discipline to prevent leaks or espionage. The city's isolation meant that many families lived entire lives without ever leaving the perimeter, and children born there grew up knowing they lived somewhere that officially did not exist. The psychological effects of this isolation were profound, with former residents describing a sense of living in a parallel world, privileged, protected, but cut off from broader society. Accidents and radiation incidents inside Arzamas-16 were inevitable, but classified, with workers exposed to harmful materials, often misdiagnosed or silenced. And the city saw several major explosions, including the 1957 accident involving the RDS-37 hydrogen bomb assembly, which destroyed a workshop building and killed several workers. Yet none of these incidents were acknowledged publicly until after the fall of the USSR. By the 1980s, Arzamas-16 had become the backbone of the Soviet nuclear complex, producing warheads for intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and strategic bombers, and its research centers continued to push nuclear design forward, even as the Soviet Union began to stagnate politically and economically. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Arzamas-16 faced a crisis. Funding disappeared. Scientists went unpaid, and the fear grew that nuclear experts might defect or sell their knowledge abroad. In response, the Russian government reclassified the city under the name Sarov and maintained it as a closed city, continuing nuclear weapons research, but also shifting towards civilian applications such as supercomputing and nuclear energy. Today, Sarov remains one of Russia's most restricted locations, heavily guarded, and still absent from many maps, with residents requiring special permits to enter or leave. Although secrecy is less intense than during the Cold War, the city's past remains largely hidden, with many documents still classified. The legacy of Arzamas-16 is one of paradox, scientific brilliance achieved under extreme isolation, national security built on the suppression of personal freedom, and technological advancement intertwined with secrecy, coercion, and tragedy. Its story reveals the extraordinary lengths the Soviet Union went to in order to match and surpass its Cold War rivals, and it stands today as a reminder that some of the most consequential events in world history occurred behind fences, checkpoints, and layers of silence, inside a city that for half a century officially did not exist. As Arzamas-16 expanded through the 1950s and 1960s, its internal structure developed into a fully self-sustaining, highly stratified society built around the mission of designing nuclear weapons. And although the city operated under absolute secrecy, its scientific output rivaled or surpassed that of any research center in the Soviet Union, attracting the country's top physicists while simultaneously imprisoning them behind layers of isolation. These scientists were given modern apartments, privileged food rations, access to cultural events, and even special stores with goods unavailable elsewhere in the USSR. Yet despite these benefits, they lived under constant surveillance by the KGB, were forbidden from discussing their work, and faced severe punishment for even minor breaches of protocol. The city's workforce included tens of thousands of engineers, technicians, soldiers, cooks, cleaners, and bus drivers, each carefully vetted and monitored, as well as prisoners who handled construction and dangerous manual labor. And although these prisoners lived in barracks under harsh conditions, their presence allowed the city to expand rapidly, with entire laboratory wings, housing districts, and technical complexes rising in just a few years. Life inside Arzamas-16 developed its own rhythms. Scientists took buses to work inside secured research compounds. Children attended elite schools staffed by some of the best teachers in the Soviet Union. Families enjoyed cinemas, libraries, cafes, and sports facilities. And yet everyone lived with the understanding that they were inside a cage, one with better lighting and food than much of the USSR, but a cage nonetheless. To maintain secrecy, every resident had to surrender their internal passport, meaning they could not leave without written permission, and visitors were forbidden. Even marriages required special state approval to ensure that spouses could be trusted not to leak information. Mail was censored, outgoing letters were scrutinized for coded references, and incoming letters sometimes never arrived if the censors believed they contained risky content. Children born in the city often grew up without knowing where they lived, since the name Arzamas-16 was classified. Instead, they learned only that the world beyond the fences was the big land, a vague concept that emphasized their separation from ordinary Soviet life. Despite these restrictions, the city became a hub of scientific innovation, with research centers such as the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics, VNIF, becoming the core institution responsible for nuclear design. Andrei Sakharov, who would later become a dissident and Nobel Peace Prize winner, spent years in Arzamas-16, working alongside Yuli Khariton and Yakov Zeldovich, and the environment inside the city, intense, intellectually electric, and filled with political tension, shaped many of Sakharov's later views on nuclear responsibility and human rights. Sakharov later wrote that although the scientists in Arzamas-16 lived physically comfortable lives, the psychological toll of secrecy and the moral burden of designing weapons capable of mass destruction weighed heavily on many of them, and internal debates within the city often centered on how far scientific responsibility extended inside a political system that demanded obedience. The technological achievements of Arzamas-16 were staggering. The city developed not only the USSR's first nuclear bomb and first hydrogen bomb, but also warheads for ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, gravity bombs, and special devices such as cleaner nuclear warheads designed to produce less fallout. Yet along with scientific breakthroughs came a series of accidents, each one hidden from the outside world and often from most city residents. One of the earliest major incidents occurred in 1957 during the assembly of an experimental thermonuclear device when a premature detonation of conventional explosives caused a blast inside a workshop, killing several workers and injuring dozens. The incident was classified immediately, and those killed were buried quietly with false death certificates listing unrelated causes such as industrial accident or heart failure. Survivors were ordered never to speak about the event. Other incidents included radiation leaks, contaminated equipment, and laboratory fires, some of which exposed employees to dangerous doses of radiation. Because the city was designed to be completely closed, medical treatment for radiation poisoning took place inside specialized clinics within the city itself. allowing the government to avoid reporting these incidents to outside medical institutions. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Arzamas-16 entered its most productive phase, designing compact nuclear warheads suitable for MIR-V, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle, missile systems, and miniaturized warheads for short-range tactical nuclear weapons. These technological advances gave the USSR the ability to deploy a broader range of nuclear systems, from strategic long-range weapons to battlefield devices intended for use in Europe. Scientific life in the city was intense. Physicists worked long hours on advanced models, conducted experiments in underground chambers, and performed nuclear component testing at remote sites connected to Arzamas-16's research network. The city also hosted secret conferences where scientists discussed breakthroughs, often under the watchful eye of security officers who ensured that no politically sensitive topics arose. Despite its isolation, Arzamas-16 maintained connections with other Soviet-closed cities, such as Chelyabinsk-70, later Snezhinsk, which served as the second major nuclear design center. The competition between these cities spawned faster development as each sought to outperform the other. Yet even as scientific progress accelerated, morale inside Arzamas-16 fluctuated. Some residents felt pride in contributing to the defense of the nation, believing that nuclear deterrence prevented war, while others struggled with the ethical implications of their work. These moral divisions deepened after the death of Stalin in 1953, and during Khrushchev's thaw, when some scientists hoped for greater transparency and peaceful applications of nuclear research. However, secrecy never loosened. Even as the rest of the USSR experienced mild political relaxation, Arzamas-16 remained locked in the rigid Cold War mentality. Another layer of psychological strain came from the fact that the city constantly expanded its infrastructure, but never opened itself to outside recognition. For decades, residents lived behind barbed wire, often for their entire careers, seeing the outside world only during rare, heavily supervised trips. Children who grew up there later described feeling like they lived on a separate planet, socially and culturally detached from those on the outside. Some even believed, incorrectly, that all Soviet cities were like this, since they had nothing to compare it to. By the early 1980s, Arzamas-16 employed a workforce of more than 20,000 scientific and technical specialists and had a population nearing 60,000 when family members were included. It had become the core of the USSR's nuclear arsenal development, responsible for designing the warheads used in ICBMs, such as the SS-18 Satan and the SS-20 Sabre, two of the most feared missiles of the Cold War. As the Cold War neared its final decade, the demands on Arzamas-16 intensified even further as the USSR sought to maintain nuclear parity with the United States, despite severe economic decline. Inside the city, scientists were ordered to continue warhead modernization, even while basic supplies such as food, clothing, and household goods became scarce across the Soviet Union. The isolation of Arzamas-16 allowed it to maintain better living standards than most of the country, but shortages still reached the city, creating tension between privileged scientists and the state that relied on their work. Yet despite the scientific brilliance produced inside Arzamas-16, the city's existence remained unknown to the Soviet public until 1991. Only after the collapse of the USSR did its history begin to surface, revealing the extent of its secrecy, the pressure placed on its workers, and the role it played in shaping global nuclear balance. Today, Arzamas-16, now officially named Sarov, continues to serve as one of Russia's main nuclear research centers, still sealed off from the outside world, still heavily guarded, and still operating behind a curtain of classification. The continuity of this city from Stalin's empire to modern Russia underscores the lasting legacy of Cold War secrecy and the enduring importance of nuclear expertise in global politics. By the time the Soviet Union entered its final decade in the 1980s, Arzamas-16 had reached a level of secrecy, sophistication, and strategic importance unparalleled anywhere else in the USSR, functioning not only as the core of the nation's nuclear weapons program, but as one of the country's most advanced scientific hubs. And yet this growing capability existed alongside increasing internal pressure as the Soviet economy deteriorated. Political stagnation deepened, and the technological demands of nuclear modernization intensified. The scientists in Arzamas-16 were expected to maintain nuclear parity with the United States, but they had to do so using aging equipment, inconsistent funding, and an often broken supply chain. Yet because of the city's privileged status, it still received more resources than most Soviet institutions, creating a double reality where the country around it declined, but the closed city continued to function with relative stability. Still, even Arzamas-16 was not immune to the consequences of the systemic decay gripping the USSR. By the mid-1980s, the city's scientific infrastructure required modernization, but economic strain and political paralysis prevented necessary upgrades. Laboratories relied on outdated computing systems, test equipment suffered from wear and tear, and maintaining the vast physical infrastructure of a closed city, its housing complexes, utilities, transportation, and security perimeters, became increasingly difficult as budget shortfalls grew. Scientists, engineers, and skilled technicians found themselves working harder to compensate for failing systems. Despite this, the nuclear design bureaus continued to produce new warhead variants, improving reliability, miniaturizing devices for missile deployment, and refining thermonuclear designs. Much of this work was classified at the highest levels, and even within the city, only a fraction of residents knew the full scope of the research being conducted. The political shifts under Mikhail Gorbachev, beginning in 1985, introduced new pressures. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, created ideological tensions within Arzamas-16, because the city's very existence depended on secrecy and rigid state control. While much of the USSR experienced a loosening of censorship and increased political debate, Arzamas-16 remained locked behind its barbed wire fences, and its residents observed these changes only through filtered and carefully approved information. The city's leaders feared that openness could destabilize the delicate security protocols guarding nuclear knowledge. At the same time, the Soviet military's demand for modernized nuclear systems did not diminish, and scientists found themselves caught between state political reforms and military expectations. The contradictions grew rapidly. A government advocating transparency oversaw a city that legally did not exist, a city whose residents could not travel freely, speak openly, or even acknowledge their workplace. The combination of secrecy, economic strain, and political uncertainty created a complex environment inside Arzamas-16 where morale fluctuated dramatically. Some scientists embraced the prospect of reform, hoping it would bring increased funding, better equipment, and improved transparency. Others feared that openness would undermine national security and expose critical research to foreign intelligence services. Meanwhile, the global nuclear landscape evolved quickly. The United States accelerated its strategic defense initiative, prompting Soviet scientists in Arzamas-16 to assess the feasibility of countermeasures, while arms control negotiations such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, presented both opportunities for de-escalation and challenges for military planners who relied on nuclear modernization to sustain deterrence. Inside Arzamas-16, researchers were tasked with evaluating the technical consequences of treaty limitations, determining which warhead types would remain relevant, and how to adapt future designs to shifting strategic needs. While most residents supported arms control in principle, they also understood that the city's existence depended on the continuation of nuclear development. As the Soviet Union moved closer to collapse, the economic crisis deepened dramatically, and by 1989, even Arzamas-16 experienced shortages of basic supplies. The city's privilege shielded it from the worst conditions facing average Soviet citizens, but rationing, delayed salaries, and inconsistent deliveries of goods became increasingly common. The USSR's wider industrial collapse threatened the steady flow of specialized materials required for nuclear research, and some laboratories were forced to halt experiments due to lack of parts. A sense of uncertainty permeated the city. Scientists who once enjoyed predictable careers now worried about the future of their institutions, their research, and their own livelihoods. These anxieties intensified when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Suddenly, Arzamas-16 found itself part of a new country, the Russian Federation, which inherited the Soviet nuclear complex but lacked the economic capacity to sustain it. Funding for nuclear research collapsed, salaries went unpaid for months, and inflation devastated the purchasing power of residents. Many scientists, now facing severe financial hardship, were approached by foreign governments, corporations, and even rogue actors offering lucrative positions abroad. Western intelligence agencies grew alarmed at the possibility of nuclear proliferation, concerned that experts from Arzamas-16 might sell their knowledge to countries seeking to develop nuclear programs. This phenomenon, often referred to as brain drain, posed one of the most serious risks of the early post-Soviet era. To mitigate this, international programs such as the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Initiative sought to provide financial support to Russia's nuclear cities, including Sarov, to prevent the emigration of nuclear experts and to ensure that nuclear materials remained secure. Although these programs helped stabilize the situation somewhat, the early 1990s were marked by chaos inside Arzamas-16. Laboratories struggled with limited resources. The city's infrastructure deteriorated due to lack of maintenance, and morale plummeted as residents wondered if their once privileged city would collapse entirely. Yet despite the economic turmoil, Arzamas-16 retained its strategic importance, and the Russian government continued to treat it as a core national security asset. Access remained strictly controlled. Foreign visitors were limited to carefully supervised inspection tours, and the city's research centers continued to work on both nuclear weapons maintenance and civilian scientific projects such as supercomputers, materials research, and nuclear energy technologies. Over the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s, Arzamas-16 underwent significant modernization. The Russian government invested in updating laboratory equipment, strengthening security perimeters, improving living conditions, and expanding civilian research programs to diversify the city's scientific output. While secrecy protocols remained rigid, internal life stabilized as salaries improved and the city's scientific mission regained clarity. Today, Arzamas-16, known officially as Sarov, remains one of Russia's most restricted cities. Only residents with government permits may enter or leave, and the city is surrounded by fences, checkpoints, and constant surveillance. Its scientific institutions continue to develop and maintain nuclear warheads, improve safety systems, and research, advanced materials, and computational models. Although the Cold War has ended, the core mission of the city persists. The people who live there still inhabit a space defined by secrecy, where scientific achievement coexists with political control and the psychological weight of working on weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. Arzamas-16 stands as a living reminder that the Cold War did not simply disappear. Its infrastructure, knowledge, and institutions continue to shape global security today. And the story of this city, the city that officially did not exist for half a century, remains one of the most striking examples of how far a superpower will go to secure scientific and military dominance. The story of Arzamas-16 is not only about weapons or secrecy, it is also about the human dimension of living in isolation under an authoritarian system that combined high technology with constant surveillance. Within its borders, life followed a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Residents celebrated holidays, raised families, and attended concerts, yet every aspect of their existence was shaped by the invisible hand of the state. Surveillance cameras dotted public buildings, internal security agents reported conversations, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were rigidly enforced. Even small social gatherings could be interrupted if discussions veered toward politics or international affairs. The psychological strain of this controlled environment was profound. Many residents developed what sociologists later called closed city syndrome, a mixture of pride, secrecy, and detachment from reality. They saw themselves as elite citizens working on something larger than life, but they also knew that their knowledge made them prisoners. The outside world remained a rumor, a distant concept experienced only through filtered Soviet media or controlled trips for high-ranking scientists. Those who left the city permanently often described feeling lost, as though they had been exiled from a hidden world that had shaped their identity. Despite this isolation, Arzamas-16 maintained an unusual sense of community. Families shared meals, scientists and engineers collaborated intensely, and cultural life was surprisingly vibrant. The city had theaters, libraries, orchestras, and sports clubs, all supported by the government to maintain morale. These comforts were not purely benevolent. They were strategic, designed to keep residents content and productive. Yet for many, they created genuine bonds that transcended ideology. Scientists from across the USSR, and even from Eastern Bloc nations, came to Arzamas-16 to collaborate, and their collective achievements became symbols of national pride. However, as the world moved into the information age, the city's model of secrecy became increasingly difficult to maintain. Globalization, satellite imagery, and leaks from defectors made it impossible to conceal its existence entirely. By the early 2000s, foreign analysts had mapped the city's layout using commercial satellite photos, identifying research buildings, housing districts, and transportation routes. The Russian government responded by tightening digital security rather than reducing secrecy. Even today, Sarov remains off-limits to foreigners and most Russian citizens. Entry requires multiple layers of clearance, and even Russian journalists cannot freely report from inside. For modern Russia, Arzamas-16 represents both a legacy and a liability, a symbol of scientific power and a reminder of a closed system that still lingers in a supposedly open era. International cooperation in nuclear research has increased since the 1990s, but Sarov continues to guard its core work, nuclear warhead design and maintenance, with the same secrecy it has maintained since Stalin's era. The city also reflects broader questions about science and ethics. The same minds that advanced humanity's understanding of atomic physics also built weapons capable of erasing it. For decades, Soviet propaganda portrayed Arzamas-16 as a beacon of progress, yet internally, many of its scientists struggled with guilt and doubt. After the Cold War ended, some publicly admitted their conflicting emotions. They had worked for peace through deterrence, yet they had also created instruments of annihilation. The figure of Andrei Sakharov became emblematic of this moral paradox. A man who designed the hydrogen bomb, yet later dedicated his life to human rights and nuclear disarmament. Within Arzamas-16, his transformation from loyal scientist to outspoken dissident was viewed with a mix of fear and admiration. Some saw him as a traitor, others as a prophet who had the courage to speak what many felt but could never say. Today, his name is commemorated inside Sarov with quiet respect, though official discourse remains cautious about his legacy. Modern Sarov has evolved into a dual-purpose city, balancing military research with civilian science. Its institutions develop advanced computing systems, materials for aerospace applications, and nuclear energy technologies. But the city's identity is still shaped by its Cold War origins. Defenses, checkpoints, and restricted zones remain. Residents live comfortably by Russian standards, but they are aware of their special status and the unspoken expectations that come with it. Every new generation inherits both the privilege and the confinement of life in a place built on secrecy. The outside world knows fragments of their existence, occasional documentaries, government press releases, or declassified photos. But the full scope of Arzamas-16's work remains hidden behind walls of classification. In many ways, the city embodies the persistence of the Cold War mindset, the belief that national security justifies isolation, that technological superiority requires silence, and that progress can exist without openness. Yet beneath the layers of secrecy, the story of Arzamas-16 is ultimately human. A story of people who built an invisible city, lived entire lives within its borders, and contributed to one of the most consequential chapters in human history. Their work changed the balance of power, defined the nuclear age, and ensured that even in the most secret corners of the Soviet Union, science remained both a tool of survival and a reflection of the society that created it. Arzamas-16 stands as a monument to the contradictions of the 20th century. Brilliance born of fear, progress sustained by control, and a legacy that continues to shape the nuclear world long after the Cold War ended.